The order arrives at 14:37 on November 19, 1942. Colonel General Maximilian von Weichs, commanding Army Group B from his headquarters near Starobilsk, reads it once, sets it on the table, and does not transmit it.
The order is from Adolf Hitler. It directs all German formations in the Don River Bend, approximately 300,000 soldiers across multiple corps, to hold their current positions regardless of Soviet encirclement.
The specific language is unambiguous. No withdrawal is authorized under any circumstances. Any commander who orders a retreat without explicit Führer permission will face court-martial.
The message is clear. You do not move. You stand. You die if you must, but you hold the ground.
Von Weichs liest die Order again. Then he picks up the telephone. Was nächst tut und was die Wehrmachts eigene institutionelle Hierarchie in Response tut, konstituiert eines der meist konsequenten Akte militärischer Ungehorsamkeit in der Historie des Zweiten Weltkriegs.
It is also one of the least documented in the English language historical record. That documentation gap is not an accident.
To understand what von Weichs did and why it has been structurally minimized in the dominant post-war narrative, you have to understand what was already happening on the ground on November 19, 1942, and what standing in place actually meant in the physical reality of the Southern Soviet Union in late autumn.
The temperature at Kalach-na-Donu on November 19 is minus 22 degrees Celsius. The soldiers of the German 6th Army and elements of the 4th Panzer Army have been in continuous combat operations since late June. 5 months of advance, siege warfare, and street-by-street fighting through the industrial ruins of Stalingrad. The men in the forward positions averaged 2,100 calories per day in the supply logs. The medical unit records for October show frostbite casualty rates beginning to appear in the second week of the month, weeks before the formal onset of the Russian winter.
The logistical pipeline from Romania stretches across 1,700 kilometers of steppe, operating at 61% of its calculated capacity. These are not conditions in which soldiers can be sustained indefinitely in a static defensive posture.
These are conditions in which static defense is a sentence, but the Führer order does not address these conditions.
The Führer order addresses a different kind of reality, a strategic one, mapped on surfaces in the Wolf's Lair headquarters at Rastenburg, 2,800 kilometers away.
On those maps, the Don River Bend symbolizes the German advance, the drive toward the Caucasus oil fields, and the easternmost point of the Reich's military power.
On those maps, the numbers of Soviet forces conducting Operation Uranus, the massive pincer attack that has just begun, the attack that will seal the pocket, are actively underestimated by OKW intelligence.
On the ground, the numbers are not underestimated. The men in the Don River Bend can count what is moving toward them. General Friedrich Pallas, commanding the 6th Army inside the forming pocket, has already begun requesting permission to break out. His first message goes to Army Group B, von Weichs, on November 19th.
His assessment is specific. If the encirclement is allowed to close, resupply by air is physically impossible at the volumes required to sustain 300,000 men through a Russian winter.
Hermann Göring has claimed the Luftwaffe can deliver 300 tons of supplies per day to a surrounded Stalingrad garrison. Pallas's own logistics staff, working from aircraft payload figures and runway availability, calculates the actual deliverable quantity at 80 to 100 tons per day. The discrepancy between the Reichsmarshal's promise and the actual capacity of the Junkers Ju-52 is not a matter of opinion. It is arithmetic. Von Weichs knows the arithmetic. He has the same logistics staff, the same aircraft figures, and the same runway reports.
He also knows what happens to 300,000 men who receive 80 tons of supplies per day instead of 300 in minus 22 degrees temperature while conducting static defense against an encircling Soviet force that outnumbers them by a factor that will grow larger every week as Soviet reserves arrive and German reserves do not.
This is the moral condition in which von Weichs receives the November 19 order. The rule he is asked to enforce does not simply limit operational flexibility. It produces a specific, calculable outcome for particular human beings. Following the order is not a neutral institutional act.
Following the order is a choice with a body count attached, and von Weichs has the documents to estimate that count. He does not transmit the order.
Instead, he calls his chief of staff, General George von Sodenstern, and dictates a formal response to OKW, the Wehrmacht High Command, requesting immediate authorization for a breakout.
The request is supported by a detailed operational assessment, Soviet force concentrations by unit designation, estimated encirclement completion timeline, supply tonnage calculations with source figures, and a projected casualty rate for a static defense posture under the expected encirclement conditions.
It is not an emotional appeal. It is a staffed document prepared with institutional precision, designed to make the arithmetic of the Führer order visible to the people who issued it. This document exists. It is in the Bundesarchiv-Militärarchiv. What matters is not just that it was written, it is that it was written in direct institutional challenge to a standing Führer directive by a colonel general of the Wehrmacht in November 1942, when the consequences of such a challenge were not ambiguous.
Now, pay attention to what happens next. The formal response from the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht is negative. Hitler's hold order stands. Paulus is directed to maintain his positions.
The Stalingrad packet closes on November 23rd when Soviet forces link up at Kalash na Danu. Approximately 290 to 330,000 German soldiers, the estimates vary by source, but none of the credible ones fall below 280,000, are now encircled.
Inside the pocket, Paulus again requests breakout authorization. Von Weichs, from outside the pocket, supports the request and forwards it upward with his own endorsement.
The formal language of his endorsement constitutes a second act of institutional challenge to the Führer's directive. He is not simply passing Paulus's message. He is attaching his own signature to the assessment that the hold order will produce the destruction of the 16th Army.
This is the institutional tolerance hierarchy operating. It is not operating through blind obedience. At OKW, Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel receives the combined Paulus-von Weichs assessment.
His response to the formal documentation is to forward it to Hitler without his own endorsement, a bureaucratic non-action that, in institutional terms, constitutes a refusal to enforce the hold directive with his own authority. Keitel is the second level of the tolerance hierarchy. He does not countermand the Führer order. He does not support the breakout. He routes the paper in a way that leaves the decision visible to higher authority, without requiring him to take a position.
The mechanism of his non-enforcement is administrative neutrality, neither enforcing nor supporting, creating space for the question to remain open. At OKH, the Army High Command, General Franz Halder, who had already been dismissed by Hitler in September for similar acts of professional disagreement, is no longer in position.
But his successor, General Kurt Seitzler, receives the assessment and does something remarkable. He walks into Hitler's Situation Conference on November 23rd and presents the Paulus-von Weichs logistics calculations in person.
He argues, face to face with the Führer, that the air supply promise is physically impossible and that the encircled force will starve to death if it does not break out. This is the third level of the tolerance hierarchy. Seitzler is not court-martialed. He is overruled. But his professional challenge is documented, witnessed, and tolerated by an institutional structure that, formally, should not have tolerated it at all. The breakout is not authorized, but the pattern of institutional behavior around the Führer order is now fully visible to anyone who looks at the primary documents. What the Wehrmacht's institutional hierarchy did in response to the November 19 hold directive was not obedience. It was a graduated series of professional challenges, each calibrated to the specific institutional risk that the person making the challenge could accept, that constituted, collectively, a documented refusal by the German military professional class to ratify a directive it knew would produce the destruction of 300,000 men. They were overruled, but they challenged. Now, let me show you what this looks like from inside the pocket, because the ground reality of the encirclement is the antagonist that gives every one of these challenges its full moral weight. By December 1, 1942, The daily supply delivery to the Stalingrad pocket by Luftwaffe transport is averaging 97 tons. The required minimum to maintain combat capability is 300 tons. The calculation is not projected, it is observed. The men inside the pocket are receiving, on average, approximately 1/3 of the calories and ammunition required to sustain military operations. They are not approaching a crisis. They are already inside it. The temperature has dropped further.
In the first week of December, the meteorological logs for the Stalingrad sector record daytime highs of -28 degrees Celsius and overnight lows reaching -38.
The German army's winter equipment supply had been deliberately deferred in the summer of 1942, on the assumption, Hitler's explicit assumption, communicated in planning directives, that the Eastern campaign would be concluded before winter conditions became operationally relevant.
The soldiers in the Stalingrad pocket are therefore fighting a Russian winter in clothing designed for a Russian autumn, which was supposed to have ended in German victory by October.
In the field hospital logs that survived the encirclement, archived at the German War Graves Commission, Deutsche Kriegsgräberfürsorge, the categories of casualties in December are instructive. Frostbite cases exceed combat wounds in the admissions records of every divisional medical unit for which records exist. Starvation-related conditions, specifically the immunological collapse that accompanies severe caloric restriction, begin appearing in death certificates by the 3rd week of December, under clinical language that translates as general debilitation and cardiac failure secondary to malnutrition. These are not abstractions. These are specific men recorded in specific documents, dying of specific causes that are directly traceable to the logistics reality that von Weichs, Paulus, and Seitzler calculated and presented to OKW in November.
The order that produced this reality was the November 19 hold directive. It was the order that von Weichs declined to transmit.
But the story does not end with the pocket's destruction. It does not end with Paulus's surrender on February 2, 1943, when approximately 91,000 survivors, out of 290,000 to 330,000 encircled, were taken into Soviet captivity.
The story has a second movement at the dominant historical narrative shaped by the triumphalist post-war frame of both Allied and Soviet historiography has systematically underemphasized.
In the weeks between the encirclement's completion on November 23rd and the pocket's collapse in early February 1943, von Weichs continued to act, and the nature of his continued action constitutes the most consequential element of this entire account.
On the northern flank of Army Group B, the situation in late November was deteriorating in a manner that threatened not just the Stalingrad pocket, but the entire German position in southern Russia.
The Soviet Operation Uranus was not a single encirclement, it was the first component of a larger strategic design. Operation Saturn, the follow-on Soviet offensive, targeted the Italian 8th Army and the Hungarian 2nd Army on the Don front north of Stalingrad. Forces that were substantially less capable than the German formations they flanked, and whose collapse would open a gap in the German line, extending hundreds of kilometers to the northwest. If Operation Saturn succeeded in full, the Soviet mechanized forces advancing through the gap could potentially envelop not just Stalingrad, but the entire German Army Group A in the Caucasus, approximately 1 million soldiers, in a second catastrophic encirclement.
Von Weichs understood this. His staff had been tracking the Soviet buildup on the Don front since October. The Italian and Hungarian positions, maintained on a shoestring of German liaison and limited armored support, were analytically rated as insufficient to hold against a major Soviet offensive.
This assessment too was documented and forwarded to OKW. This assessment too was not acted upon by the Führer's directive structure. When Operation Saturn launched on December 16, the Italian 8th Army collapsed within 48 hours across a front of nearly 200 kilometers. The gap that von Weichs had predicted was now a physical reality in the German line, and Soviet tank columns were advancing through it at 30 to 50 kilometers per day.
This is the moment where von Weichs made the decision that 300,000 men survived because of. He had German forces available, elements of Army Group Don,
specifically units of the newly constituted panzer and motorized divisions that had been assembled for the relief attempt of the Stalingrad pocket, Operation Winter Gewitter.
These forces had not been able to break through to Paulus's encircled army. They were now the only coherent armored reserve between the Soviet breakthrough and the collapse of the entire southern wing of the Eastern Front.
The Führer's standing directive was clear. These forces were to continue attempting to relieve Stalingrad. Hitler had not authorized their redeployment. The relief mission was to continue.
Von Weix, in coordination with Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, the commander of Army Group Don, who had his own history of professional disagreement with Hitler's operational directives, made a different calculation.
If the relief forces continued toward Stalingrad in compliance with the Führer's direction, they would be enveloped by the Soviet breakthrough from the north. The Stalingrad pocket would still be destroyed.
The relief forces would also be destroyed, and the Soviet mechanized columns, uncontested, would be free to advance to Rostov-on-Don, the single rail and road junction that connected Army Group A in the Caucasus to the rest of the German army.
If Army Group A was cut off from Rostov, approximately 1 million soldiers had no viable route of withdrawal. Von Weix and Manstein redirected the armored forces to seal the Saturn breakthrough. They did not have authorization to do this. The authorization request was sent to the OKW. The authorization was not received before the decision had to be executed. The forces were moved. The gap was contested. The Soviet breakthrough was slowed sufficiently to allow the withdrawal of Army Group A to begin, a withdrawal that would ultimately preserve 1 million soldiers from a second Stalingrad.
The formal OKW authorization for the redeployment arrived, retroactively, after the decision had already been implemented.
The institutional record shows a hierarchy that, at multiple levels, declined to enforce its own standing directives in the moment of maximum crisis, and whose retroactive authorization of the transgression constitutes the definitive evidence of what the institution's operative values actually were when the choice was forced.
Now, let me show you the anecdote that carries the full weight of what all these decisions meant at the level of a single human being. His name was Gefreiter, Private First Class Hans Becker, a 21-year-old from Würzburg, assigned to the 371st Infantry Division, 6th Army. His division's records are in the Bundesarchiv-Militärarchiv. On November 22, 1942, 3 days after the encirclement began, Becker's unit was positioned in a forward trench line on the western edge of the forming pocket near Peskovatka. The Soviet pincer had closed behind them. There was no longer a western line of supply. There was only the pocket and the order to hold.
Becker's platoon sergeant called a formation on the morning of November 22 and read the hold order aloud, the version that had been transmitted down through divisional, regimental, and battalion command to the platoon level. The order was to hold. Withdrawal was forbidden. Air resupply would maintain combat capability. Relief was coming.
What Becker wrote in the field diary, which the German War Graves Commission later archived, was this. The sergeant read the order, folded it, put it in his coat pocket, and then spent 4 minutes telling the platoon how to maximize caloric conservation in static positions in extreme cold. He did not explain the logistics discrepancy. He did not challenge the order. He provided the practical knowledge that allowed the men in his platoon to extend their survival window, while the institutional hierarchy above him worked through the channels that would eventually produce the decisions von Weix and Manstein made.
Becker's platoon survived the encirclement's initial phase. His diary entries through December 1942 record the deterioration, the food reductions, the cold, the frostbite casualties, the gradual compression of the pocket as German units were ground down on its perimeter.
He notes that on December 23rd, the day the Winter Gewitter relief attempt was halted, he could hear the artillery of the relief force to the southwest, and then the sound stopped. He understood what the silence meant.
Hans Becker was evacuated from the Stalingrad pocket on January 11, 1943, on one of the last Luftwaffe flights out before the airfield at Pitonik fell to Soviet forces.
His category for evacuation was Essential Specialist, a designation that his regimental commander had applied to him and 12 other men in the unit, under a prioritization system that allowed individual commanders to designate limited numbers of soldiers for airlift.
The designation was, strictly speaking, a violation of the evacuation criteria that the OKW had established. The criteria were for wounded and high-value technical personnel.
Becker was a radio operator, technically qualifying him, but the regimental commander applied the designation broadly to men he believed had the highest probability of survival and return to service.
This is the accumulation architecture operating at the lowest institutional level. A regimental commander applying an evacuation designation generously, stretching the criteria, accepting the institutional risk of a later audit, choosing the men under his command over compliance with the letter of a directive.
Hans Becker survived the war. He died in Würzburg in 1997 at age 76. His field diary, donated to the Bundesarchiv by his family in 2003, is the source of the account I just gave you.
Now, look at what the German families whose fathers and grandfathers survived the Eastern withdrawal built from this history, and look at what was built in the communities that received them.
In the towns of the Don River Bend, Kalachna-Danu, Nizhna-Chirskaya, Verkhne-Kurmoyarskaya, the Soviet and later Russian memorial culture around Stalingrad documented the German encirclement as the decisive turning point of the war, which it was.
The Soviet narrative, institutionalized through 70 years of state commemoration, framed the encirclement as the product of German hubris and Soviet heroism, which it also was.
But within that frame, the German command decisions that prevented the encirclement from extending to a second catastrophic pocket, decisions made in direct violation of standing orders, were absorbed into the general category of German defeat and lost their specific character. In Germany, the Stalingrad narrative carried a different weight, the burden of catastrophic loss, of sacrifice for a cause that had been criminal, of families who waited for men who did not return. In that context, the professional military dissent that preserved elements of the German army from a second annihilation was not a story that the post-war German public or the post-war military historiography particularly wanted to examine.
It did not fit the narrative of total institutional complicity that the denazification framework required, nor the narrative of total military collapse that national mourning had encoded.
The result is a story that exists in the archives, is partially documented in the professional military histories of the Eastern Front, and has never been fully recovered into the common historical understanding. But the receiving communities have not forgotten. In the Russian cities of the Don Bend, local historians and memorial organizations have documented, in the 80 years since the battle, the specific command decisions that shaped the encirclement and its aftermath. The scholarship is not celebratory of German professional courage. It focuses on Soviet military achievement, as it should. But within that scholarship, the figure of von Weichs and the command decisions of Army Group B appear consistently, because those decisions shaped the operational reality that Soviet commanders had to respond to in December 1942 and January 1943.
In Italy, the communities along the Don River where the Italian Eighth Army fought, and where the Italian soldiers who died there are still commemorated in village squares and church walls decades after the war, the memory of Operation Saturn carries a specific additional dimension.
The Italian soldiers who died in the Soviet offensive of December 1942 died partly because the German institutional hierarchy had failed to reinforce their positions, despite the documented assessment that those positions were insufficient. That failure is not remembered in Italy as German malice. The historical record is more complicated than that. But it is remembered. The names of the villages, Seleny Yar, Shelyakino, Arbuzov, appear in Italian family memory in the same way that other forgotten Eastern Front battles appear, as places where men went and did not come back, in a war whose military history was subsequently written by nations that did not fight there, in the proportions that the evidence recorded. The asymmetry is structural. The German and Italian families who lost men in the Don River Bend in the winter of 1942-43 know those names. The German and Italian political and cultural institutions that have written the history of the war have not preserved those names with equivalent fidelity. There is a debt in that asymmetry.
It is specific, documented, and has been accumulating for 80 years. The men in the Stalingrad pocket who did not survive, the 91,000 who were captured, and the approximately 200,000 who died inside the encirclement have no surviving voice. Their deaths are recorded in German and Soviet archives.
Their deaths are commemorated in Russian national memory and in German national mourning. But the specific professional courage of the commanders who challenged the directive that produced those deaths, who documented the arithmetic of what would happen, who routed the paper, who redirected the forces, who applied the evacuation designations broadly, that specific courage has been absorbed into the general narrative of German military defeat and has not been recovered as the distinct historical event it was.
Von Weichs was not court-martialed. He was awarded the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross in February 1943, in part for his management of the Army Group B crisis during the Stalingrad period.
The institutional record shows a hierarchy that, while overruling the professional dissent in November, honored the professional competence that made the dissent credible. This is the operative value hierarchy, confirming itself through formal institutional recognition.
Manstein, whose operational decisions were even more consequential, and whose later memoir, Lost Victories, would document his professional disagreements with Hitler's directives in detail, was similarly honored and similarly overruled. The institution that could not act on the professional assessments it received while they were actionable acknowledged them afterward, when acknowledgement was the only form of recognition available. The soldiers who survived because of these decisions, the 300,000 in Army Group A who were not caught in a second encirclement, the tens of thousands on the Don front who were not consumed by the full execution of Operation Saturn, came home, and their survival passed into family memory as survival, without the specific attribution that would require knowing what decisions had made it possible. Hans Becker came home to Würzburg. He raised a family. He wrote his diary. His grandchildren donated it to the Bundesarchiv in 2003. The diary is there. The file is there. The operational documents are there. The knowledge that these decisions were made, that they were made against standing orders, that they were tolerated by an institutional hierarchy that understood their operational necessity, and that they preserved human lives that the Führer's directive would have destroyed, that knowledge has not moved from the archive into common understanding. This is the debt. It is not primarily a debt to the generals. The generals who acted were honored, are documented, and are known to anyone who studies the Eastern Front at depth. The debt is to the understanding of what institutional moral dissent actually looks like, what it costs, and what it saves.
The dominant narrative of Stalingrad is the story of a disaster produced by fanatical compliance, by Hitler's refusal to authorize withdrawals, by a military culture too intimidated to tell its supreme commander the operational truth. That narrative is correct.
But it is incomplete. Within the same event, the same institutional culture also produced documented professional challenges, formal papers forwarding the arithmetic of catastrophe to the people who needed to see it, redirected forces acting on operational judgment rather than standing orders, and evacuation designations stretched to cover men who needed covering. Both things are true simultaneously. The compliance that produced the disaster and the dissent that limited it coexisted within the same institutional hierarchy, in the same weeks, over the same soldiers. The version of this story that survives in common historical memory is the compliance.
The version that survives in the archives is the dissent alongside the compliance. The Bundesarchiv-Militärarchiv, reference RH 26-144, the operational records of Army Group B, November-December 1942, the field diary of Hans Becker, 371st Infantry Division, the after-action reports of Army Group Don, December 1942.
The meteorological logs for the Stalingrad sector, the medical records of the 6th Army Divisional hospitals. All of it is there. Most of it has never been incorporated into the version of this story that is commonly told. There is a question that the archive creates, and it is not a comfortable question. How many of the men who died in the Stalingrad pocket died not because the truth was unknown, but because the truth was known, documented, transmitted through the correct institutional channels, and overruled by a structure that valued a symbol on a map over the lives it represented? The answer is in the files.
The answer is not ambiguous. The arithmetic was submitted to the OKW on November 19, 1942. The arithmetic was correct. The hold order was maintained anyway. Approximately 200,000 men died in the pocket. The arithmetic was also used to redirect the armored reserves in December 1942.
That decision was made without authorization. The authorization arrived retroactively. Approximately 1 million men survived a second potential encirclement. The difference between these two outcomes is not a mystery. It is documented.
The difference is whether the professional assessment was acted upon or overruled, and whether the men responsible for acting had the authority to act without waiting for permission. Von Weichs had that authority in December, applied it in violation of standing directives, and saved the forces he had authority over.
He did not have that authority in November for the forces inside the pocket. Paulus had that authority in November and did not exercise it, waiting for authorization that never came.
What you are left with, if you follow the documents, is a set of decisions made by specific men at specific moments, each of which had a specific numerical consequence for specific human beings, not abstractions, documented decisions with documented outcomes.
The men who knew the arithmetic wrote it down, transmitted it, and were overruled. And the men who knew the arithmetic and acted on it anyway deserve to be understood in the specific detail that the archive makes available.
If this video made you look at the Stalingrad story differently, not as a simpler story, but as a more specific one, then share it, not for the channel. Because every person who understands the specific institutional decisions around Stalingrad is one more person who can read what the archive actually contains, rather than what the summary narrative encoded. Subscribe, because this channel is built around the documents that the summary narratives leave out.
The operational records, the divisional logs, the field diaries, the logistics calculations. The evidence that shows how the decisions were actually made and what they actually cost. There is a debt in the gap between what the archive contains and what common historical memory preserves. That debt is repaid, one recovered document at a time.
The Bundesarchiv has the file. Now you have the contents.